Well, I want to start this morning with a question. And the question is, Haley, do you like bacon? Yes, ma'am. I was, of all the food that's out there, bacon seemed to be what was on the radar. So, well, this is part 5 of this series, and that we've been in for 5 weeks. And Jesus said that you can boil down the entire Old Testament and even all of his teaching to this: love God, love one another, and love your what? You love your enemy. The Jesus way would be the way of love and the way of freedom. Okay, but and we looked at this like in depth in week 1 of this series. But after Jesus was gone and his followers began to gather, some Jewish believers came along and said, hey, guys, Jesus was Jewish, and all of his disciples were Jewish, and now that we look back on the Old Testament, the old Jewish scriptures, in light of his life, we see that Jesus is all over it. So we think that anyone that wants to become a Christian should become fully Jewish first. Like they need to follow all of the Old Testament customs and laws and rituals. And so we saw that the leaders of this new movement got together and they talked at length about this, and they decided, no way. Okay, we are not going to make people that aren't Jewish become Jewish and follow all the laws and the rituals and ceremonies, because this new movement is going to be marked by freedom and love. Freedom and love. So in this series, we're imagining what it was like to follow Jesus for those very first believers. What was it like in the very beginning? Because the new believers didn't follow all the laws of the Old Testament. And the reality is there was no New Testament yet. I mean, the Apostle Paul, the guy who wrote about half of the New Testament, he didn't even start writing until about 25 years after Jesus. And then it took another at least 25 years for those letters to begin to be circulated widely. So for the first 50 or more years of the movement, you think about it, that's not a lot to go on, right? I mean, they were left with this odd assortment of parables and teachings, and really all they had were the teachings of Jesus and the stories of the miracles and so forth that were passed on by the disciples and other eyewitnesses. So in this series, what we're doing is we're kind of like stepping back in time, and we're asking the question, what would it have been like to be a Jesus follower, like those very first followers, if all we had to go on to try to live this out were a few of the teachings of Jesus? And so we've been looking at some of the more core teachings of Jesus, and things Jesus wants to free us from. We've looked at freedom from fear. So to actually begin to live like free of fear, at least unhealthy fear. Now we looked at freedom from judgment. Like Jesus is inviting us into a life that's free of just walking around judging everybody. And then last week we looked at sin. And this is kind of a big one, right? When you think about it, Jesus wants to free us from sin. And that's huge. It's like so huge. It's so central to what he came to do. And what's interesting to me is after last week's message, a message on freedom from sin, I got more positive feedback from you guys than I've gotten over a message in a long, long time. I had so many people come to me and go, that was uniquely helpful to me. And yet when I look at that word, sin, it is a word that's been so badly handled. Like for pretty much 2,000 years, the church has done a horrible job with it. And it's done such a horrible job that for many people, the very mention of that word causes repulsion, right? I mean, just sin. What does that do? What does that do in you, right? And so for last week, even though last week's message was kind of a breakthrough for many of you, I noticed something really interesting this week. Usually when a message is posted online, it might get 10 views, or if it's especially a good one and the word gets around or whatever, there's 20 or 30 views like the first week of the message. Like by the time, so last week, the message entitled Freedom from Sin, as of last night, it had 2 views. And I just, here's what I think. I think that's a testimony to how badly the church has handled that concept for 2,000 years. Nobody wants to hear a message on sin. Because here's the deal. One of those views was me. Just making sure like the audio worked and everything. And so here, like this is why we're doing this, because we get confused about what Jesus is actually teaching, what he's inviting us into. And so we're trying to go back to the beginning. We're trying to go back to the early days of the faith. And so today we're going to think about another freedom that Jesus wants for us, something that can be a huge deal. We're going to look at what Jesus said about freedom from doubt. Okay, freedom from doubt. Now, for some of you might find yourself just kind of thinking, well, okay, how can I possibly be like set free from doubt? In fact, how can I be free from any of this stuff? Like, okay, this is a nice, cute idea for a sermon series, Jason. But my fears and my worries and my doubts and the way I view people around me and judge them, like that's always going to be there. There's nothing you can say and there's nothing Jesus can say to really impact that. And I just want to say, like, I get that. I totally get that. And the reality is when Jesus first started teaching these things, nobody took them seriously. Like during the life and the ministry of Jesus, people were like, what? What are you talking about? We can't like not be afraid or not doubt or not worry. Like that's just crazy. And honestly, all of it to them seemed utterly ridiculous until they encountered the risen Jesus. And suddenly his followers started to understand. They started to say, oh, okay, now we get it. And they started to embrace these really extreme teachings and they actually began to live them. They discovered freedom in all of these areas that they never realized was possible. And so that's what we've been thinking about, the Jesus way, the way of freedom. And today we're looking at freedom from doubt, because over and over, Jesus would say to his disciples, doubt not, right? Doubt not. Don't doubt. Like, why did you doubt? And I think it's kind of helpful to recognize as we sort of get into this, that our doubts usually go into one of 2 buckets. And the buckets are, is it true? And is it worth it? Right? Is it true? And is it worth it? And so, there are all these is it true kinds of questions. Is Jesus really the Son of God? Did all of that stuff the Bible talks about, did it actually happen? These are is it true kind of doubts. And then there's a whole slew of like, is it worth it kinds of questions. Is it worth it to follow Jesus if I have to give things up? Is it worth it to follow Jesus if I'm like missing out? Is it worth it to follow Jesus when it looks like I'm making all kinds of sacrifices that other people aren't making? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Now, if you're someone who wrestles with doubt, I have some good news for you. 100% of Jesus' first century followers doubted. Okay, I mean, like, think about it. They all doubted. Like John the Baptist doubted. John the Baptist, he doubted. And we talked about this at Easter time. John the Baptist, the guy that Jesus actually said was the greatest man that ever lived. The guy that prepared the way for Jesus, that preached and drew these huge crowds, and at one point told his followers, talking about Jesus, behold the Lamb of God that comes to take away the sin of the world. And he said, I'm not even worthy to untie and tie his sandals. Okay, and I must decrease and he must increase. But not long after that, John was arrested and he was put in a dungeon. And he started to doubt. And so he sent his friends to Jesus to ask, like, are you really the one? Because life went sideways. And Jesus didn't act like John thought Jesus should act. And so John the Baptist doubted. And he starts wondering from his dungeon cell, is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? Is it really? And guys, you think about all the apostles, all the guys closest to Jesus. At the end, when Jesus is arrested, do they all stand by him? No. They decide, okay, it ain't worth it, and I'm not really sure it's true. And they all run away, and they all abandon Jesus. In fact, one of Jesus' most inner circle guys, one of his closest guys, he actually got a nickname that deals with doubt. Okay, his name was Doubting Thomas. Bummer for him, for 2,000 years, because he did some amazing things with, his faith with Jesus, but he's Doubting Thomas, And at the very end, with Thomas, he didn't doubt like at the beginning. He doubted at the very end, which means, and this is good news, I think, Jesus doesn't toss you out because you doubt. Jesus doesn't toss you out because you doubt. And we know that that's true because it rhymes. So here's something you need to know. You can have all of these doubts and follow Jesus at the same time. You can follow Jesus even in the midst of doubts. You do not have to have all of your doubts worked out. You don't have to understand everything to be able to believe something. You don't have to be able to explain everything about Christianity to someone else to believe something. To follow Jesus, you don't have to have all of your doubt worked out first. That's just not how it works. And it's never been how it works. Those same guys who ate with Jesus, the same guys who walked with him and talked with him and essentially lived a life with him for 3 years, even amidst all of the miracles and the crazy things that they saw, they still wrestled with doubts all along the way with Jesus. And so that's good news. And here's why this is important. For some of you, your faith is starting to grow. There is something about Jesus that's so real and so true and so good to you, and yet at the same time, you've got that going on, and at the same time, you still have questions, right? You still have some doubts. And you have felt okay, until I get all of that stuff worked out, then I can't do this. I can't be a follower of Jesus. I can't be a Christian. And I just want to say today, and this may be really, really good news for some of you, you can follow Jesus right through the midst of your doubts, because this is how it's done. This is always how it's been done. Because as many of us have experienced, sometimes doubt actually leads to great discovery. Sometimes doubt leads to greater faith. Sometimes doubt leads to learning things that we would not have learned any other way. But here's why Jesus said not to doubt. And here's why it's so important. Because if you don't deal with it, your doubt can just take you out. That wasn't supposed to be funny, Andrea. Now, Peter, don't worry, I'll call you out later if you're... This is kind of going sideways. This feels like a Jen moment up here. God bless my wife. Now, Peter experienced this in a very dramatic and memorable way. And so we're going to look at a very famous story that many of you are familiar with. The disciples are in a boat, and they're on the sea, and Jesus comes walking out to them. And at first, if you remember, the disciples are terrified, right? Because they think it's a ghost. But Peter sees Jesus standing out on the water, and he thinks, okay, Jesus, all right. I think I've got this thing figured out. If you invite me out of this boat to come walk on the water, I think I can do this too. But you have to invite me. This has to be, and this is so important, this has to be your idea. This is not if I really believe I can do anything I want to do. This has to be you inviting me to do something you want me to do. This is not me like conjuring up my own power through positive thinking. This like, I think I can walk on water, That's not faith. That's just magic. But if you ask me to do it, I think I might be able to do it, Jesus. And so Jesus looks at Peter and he says, that's right. Come on out. So Peter climbs out of the boat and he starts walking on the water with Jesus. And then many of you remember what happens, because Jesus gives us our first clue in sort of how to deal with doubt. Here's what happened. Peter is walking on the sea with Jesus. And it says, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid and beginning to sink, cried out, Lord, save me. And Jesus' response is awesome. Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. You of little faith, he said. Why did you doubt? So notice, Peter doubted, right? And he started to fall, and then he cried out. And Jesus didn't go, well, sucks for you, Pete. Should have had more faith, man. Now you're going to have some problems, because when you get to the bottom down there, it's going to be hard to breathe. No, like Jesus, he sees this happening and Jesus reaches out his hand and he catches him, and yet at the same time he asks, why did you start doubting? And I'll tell you, I think, the text doesn't tell us. I'll tell you why I think Peter started doubting. Because he was walking on water, right? Like, you can't walk on water. Did you know that? Like people know, like, you can't walk on water. And so Peter is walking on the water and he looks around and he sees the storm and he sees the wind and the waves. And he starts recognizing all of the craziness going on around him, and that starts to become more real to him than Jesus. And the reality that he was already walking with Jesus just sort of faded away, and in an instant, he began to sink. And this is, I think, such a tangible picture of what happens to so many of us. Like, you encounter Jesus at some point, maybe as a child, maybe as a teen, maybe as an adult, and you begin to walk with him. And you trust him. And you start to encounter crazy stuff. Like, your heart is set free and you can feel that. And your guilt is taken away and it's lifted. And you sense him inviting you to take some risks. And you do. And he meets you in those. And you are experiencing his power. You are doing it. Like, you are walking with him. It is happening. And then you realize that there's this storm that's all around you. Maybe something that you really want to happen isn't happening. Like, you don't want to be single, but you are. Or you want a baby, but there's no pregnancy. You get a really difficult report from a doctor, or you lose your job, or you lose somebody that you love. There's this storm. Suddenly there's this storm and it's raging and you can see it and you can feel it and it becomes very tangible to you, and you begin to take your eyes off of Jesus and you stop walking, and before you know it, you're sinking. Or maybe the storm is like your friends or just like the culture around you, because they aren't followers of Jesus. And they're not living like you, and you see how they're living, and you kind of want to do what they do. Like, maybe you're single and you see how your friends are single and they don't live like you do, and you think, man, I just want to kind of do this like they do this. And that becomes your focus, and pretty soon you're sinking. Or maybe you've got a ton of people around you who don't follow Jesus, and they haven't encountered him like you have. They don't see him like you do, and they have all of these criticisms of Christians and the church and Christianity in general, and you find that those criticisms are eating you up. They're consuming you. In fact, you're a whole lot more infatuated with their criticisms, and you're becoming a whole lot less infatuated with Jesus. And your focus has shifted. It's shifted. And now you find yourself sinking. Jesus asks Peter, Peter, why did you doubt? Why did you doubt? And you can feel the tone of this. It's like Jesus is baffled. He's baffled. And maybe the reason that Jesus is baffled is because he's like, Peter, you were already walking on water. Like, did you feel the power? Did you experience the miracle? You were walking on water. Now, I mean, this would make Peter's doubts, they'd make a whole lot more sense if Peter was still in the boat, right? Peter's in the boat and Jesus invites him out and Peter's skeptical. He's like, I don't know, Jesus. Walking on water's hard. I'm not sure I can. I have doubts. Okay, Jesus would go, okay, yeah, from the boat, that makes a little more sense. But Jesus doesn't ask this question while Peter's still in the boat. He asks the question after Peter has already walked on the water. Peter was in the middle of walking on the water when he doubted. And I just wonder, have you ever experienced that? Have you ever done that? Because it might be that Jesus is saying to you, like, you have little faith. I love you. And I'm reaching out to you and I'm catching you. Make no mistake about it. I am catching you. I'm with you. But why did you doubt? You were doing it. You were walking on the water. You were walking with me and it was so real and it was so good. You took the risk. You got out of the boat and you were doing it. Why did you start doubting? And notice when Peter started to sink, he cried out, right? Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out a hand. Like in the midst of his doubts, when he cried out, Jesus met him there immediately. If you're sinking in doubts, if you find yourself sinking in doubts, I just wonder, have you cried out to Jesus? Like, has that been part of the whole process? Have you cried out to Jesus? Have you really? Because sometimes when we doubt, when we start to sink, we think, oh man, well, this is hard. Oh man, if I were ever to go back to Jesus, I'd have to work through all of this stuff myself on my own. And then somehow, if I could work through all of this stuff on my own, if I could get through all of this, then maybe at the completion of that, I could walk with Jesus again. And I just want to say, maybe like if that's your approach, doing this whole thing on your own is completely unnecessary. Because maybe Jesus is just waiting for you to cry out. Maybe he's longing to reach out a hand to you. And maybe he can actually bring you through this. We're going to come back to that idea in a minute. But if you have doubts, if you wrestle with doubt, you need to know, okay, you're not the exception to the rule. All of Jesus' first century followers felt that same tension. They all, in spite of everything they saw, when you think about it, everything they saw, they had periods of doubt. But Jesus reached out to them continually, over and over again, and he caught them anyway. There's another little teaching Jesus gives about doubt, another breadcrumb on the trail that kind of helps us deal with doubt. Jesus was with his guys, his disciples, and he had just done a minor miracle. Well, you go, what's a minor miracle? Well, it's not as big as a major miracle. So this was not Jesus bringing Lazarus back from the dead. This was not Jesus calming a raging storm, right? This was a minor miracle. But the disciples are like, whoa, Jesus, that was awesome. That was so cool. And Jesus essentially says to him, that was nothing. And then he says something that's really been misinterpreted, especially in the past 30, 40, 50 years in the United States. This has been so badly taught in certain places and so misunderstood. Jesus was trying to make a very important point that's so easy to miss. Now here's what he said to his disciples that were amazed at his minor miracle. Jesus replied, "Truly I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, you can say to this mountain, 'Go throw yourself into the sea,' and it will be done." Now, Jesus is talking to good Jewish boys who grew up on Torah, who grew up with Old Testament teaching. And the furthest thing from their mind was the idea that they could somehow come up with like a magic prayer And if they asked it in the right way, using the right words, with the right emotion, and they conjured up enough faith, they could force God to do something that God wasn't really wanting to do already. They didn't think that way. They had more respect for God than that. That is Western Christianity gone awry. That is name it and claim it. That is prosperity gospel. That is magic and hocus pocus. That is not the teaching of Jesus. Jesus' point was simply this. Here's what he's saying to them. He's saying, guys, if you think moving a mountain is a big deal, it's not a big deal. If you think walking on water is a big deal, it's not a big deal. Guys, you have no idea what God is willing to do for you. And more importantly, you have no idea what God is willing to do through you if you will just trust God, follow God, and not let yourself be swallowed up by doubt. So don't allow your doubt to take you out, because if you do, you will miss out on what God has for you. And a simple way of saying this is, what God originates, God will orchestrate if you don't doubt. Like, guys, you think this little miracle that I just did is a big deal? I'm telling you, you have no idea what your Heavenly Father will do if you will trust Him. If you go where He leads, if you'll obey what He commands, like even if it doesn't fully make sense to you. Because God orchestrates what He originates. But you've got to trust Him enough to be there for it. Then in John chapter 6, the disciples, they faced doubt again. And this time they come to the ultimate issue surrounding doubt. Because this was like do or die. This was like do or die kind of doubt. This was huge, huge doubt. And if they'd not been able to move past it, if they weren't able to work through this and somehow come out on the other side, the movement of Jesus, it would have died right then and right there. And none of us, think about this, none of us would have ever heard of Jesus. So all of you that are named like Peter and Andrew and James and John, you guys would probably have different names, right? Because if they had not overcome their doubt here, these guys would have faded into obscurity. They were on the very edge of allowing doubt. Okay, is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? They were on the very edge of allowing those doubts to snuff out their faith altogether, to just walk away from all of it. So here's the situation. Jesus has just fed thousands out of a little kid's lunch sack. Like He has multiplied the fish and the loaves. And food was so hard to come by in that time and in that place. So free food, it was like gold. I mean, just like gold. Now, everybody likes free food, right? I mean, we like free food. We do. We get pretty dang excited about free food, and we live in abundance. Like, there is food available to us everywhere. So imagine people living in abject poverty getting free food on that scale. It's just like, what a miracle. And so the people are infatuated with Jesus and all that He can do. And so they catch up with Him the next day, and Jesus realizes, whoa, like, they're missing the point. Like, all they want is the miracles. Just more miracles, more miracles. They're missing the point. So Jesus refuses to do another miracle, and He starts teaching. And He takes the imagery of bread, because that's fresh on everybody's mind, and He says things like this. He says, hey, if you think yesterday's bread was good, I'm the bread of life. So like the bread you ate yesterday was temporary, but I'm eternal. I can give you bread that will last forever. If you eat of it, you'll never go hungry again. And I have to imagine the crowd starting to get fired up. They're like, whoa, really? Sweet. Like, what kind of bread is this, Jesus? And they're like elbowing each other like, guys, He's about to do another miracle. Like something that makes yesterday seem like child's play. Like here it comes. Like, are you guys ready? Free bread for life. This is going to be awesome. And then the whole scene changes because Jesus continues. He says, this is how it works. I am the bread of life. And so you just need to eat my body and drink my blood. I was like, uh-oh. Turns out that's not like super popular. So the crowd they're disgusted. Like seriously, they were like completely turned off like that. Now, some people were a little bit more tolerant. They're like, what? Okay, like I get that that's probably a word picture. But still, like, that's weird. And Jesus' critics at this point, they're going crazy. They're like, oh yeah. So they pulled out their phones. They're like, we got him. He's like, Jesus says, at Found Fault with Jesus, Critics are like, we got him. He's nailed. And they start stirring things up in the crowd, and there's this murmur, and it says, on hearing it, many of his disciples, okay, not the 12, but people that have been following him that are in a much larger, broader group, on hearing it, many of his disciples said, this is hard teaching. Who can accept it? And then the murmur begins to go beyond murmur and it starts to turn into action. It says, from this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. So in the crowd, there were many, many disciples, not the 12, but this much broader community of followers. And they walked away in this moment and they stopped following. So the apostles are sitting there and they're listening to Jesus with this whole like eat my flesh, drink my blood, crazy teaching, and they're losing the crowd. They're watching people wander away, and they're sitting there. You have to imagine they begin to wonder, like, okay, is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? But in that moment, they have no idea what hangs in the balance, what they would miss out on if they too decided to walk away and quit following. Because Jesus has chosen them and invited them to do things far more extraordinary than just walk on water or even move mountains. Jesus chose them to shape history, to be the witnesses of God offering forgiveness to the world. Jesus chose them to teach the world to love. He chose them to go out and infiltrate some of the most horrendous things within the Roman culture and to bring grace and love to it. And then to eventually influence the entire world. But they don't see that. They don't know it yet. And they are on the verge, as they're watching all of this, of joining the crowd that's walking away because they're not sure it's true and they're not sure it's worth it. And Jesus is teaching, and they're sitting there listening to Jesus, and they're wrestling with all of this, and they're watching the crowds get thinner and thinner. And Jesus turns to them, and he says, you do not want to leave too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. But they're sitting there, and they're like, busted. Yeah, we're thinking it over. Because we don't understand what you're doing here. It seems weird, it seems hard. Jesus, why not do another miracle? The crowd was eating out of your hand, literally. And so, this teaching is weird and confusing and it's not working very well. What are you doing? So yeah, we're thinking about leaving. And then out of all of this awkward silence, Jesus asked the questions, and the question you have to imagine the disciples are like, Peter speaks up and he raises a huge question. One that we really can't lose sight of when we wonder, is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? Says Simon Peter answered him, and this would be out loud, Lord, to whom shall we go? To whom shall we go? And guys, that question is huge, isn't it? It's huge. In fact, to kind of drive it home, I want us to ask that together. Okay? Lord, to whom shall we go? One more time. Lord, to whom shall we go? Okay, if you were spacing out just a second ago and counting the lights, I just want to ask you to tune back in. In fact, Zachary, would you stand up for a second? Come into the aisleway right there. Okay, give me your. The arm on that kid. Are you all with me? Okay. This is a big question that Peter is asking. Lord, to whom shall we go? And I want us to make that a little more personal and substitute I in there. Okay, Lord, to whom shall I go? Okay, Lord, to whom shall I go? That is a big, big, big question. And this is the question that you must bring to bear on your doubt. Because here's the question Peter knew he needed to ask. Okay, if not Jesus, who? If not Jesus, what? Because guys, here's the reality. If you walk away from Jesus, you have to be walking toward something else. What is that something else? What is it? Where will it lead you? What's waiting for you at the end of that? And let's be honest, this is a big, big deal. So Peter has this thought, he's thinking it through, and he's decided, okay, you're right, Jesus. I was thinking about leaving too, but then it dawned on me, to whom shall I go? And then Peter follows up the question with an extraordinary statement. Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. It's like, there's weird stuff that I don't get here, but who else is going to offer us eternal life? Nobody else would even dare talk about that. The kingdom of God you keep talking about, we believe that that's real. We've seen way too much to just deny it, to just write it off. The miracles, the teaching. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God. And Jesus answered him and said, you ain't seen nothing yet, bro. So, okay, that's not exactly what Jesus said. But I bring this up because they had no idea, right? They had no idea where this was going. They had no idea what they almost walked away from. They can't decide if it's worth it because they have no idea what's going to happen next. And Jesus knows, and he's thinking, guys, you have no idea what hangs in the balance of this decision. And they have this discussion, and it's meaningful, and there's this moment. And then they continue to doubt. They doubted right up to the very end. But they never completely abandoned Jesus until it all seemed like it was over when he got arrested. And even then, even though they abandoned him in that moment, Jesus didn't kick him out. In fact, after the resurrection, it was this group of former doubters who poured into the streets of Jerusalem and boldly proclaimed that Jesus had been raised from the dead and that he was the Messiah and that God was doing something brand new on earth. And God used that little group of doubters to bring the story of Jesus all the way to the 21st century, to bring the love and the hope of Christ all the way to you and to me. The doubters became the announcers. They became the ones that shouted from the rooftops. Now this is why it's so important for all of you who claim to be a Christian, or all of you who grew up in the church or came to Jesus at a later point, or all of you who at this point are on the outside and you're looking in and you're wondering if this whole thing is worth putting a toe in the water over. You will never know what God would have done. You'll never know what God would have done if you allow your doubt to take you out. You'll never know what God might have done in your marriage. You'll never know what God would have done in your current relationship. You'll never know what God might have done financially. Never know what God could have done professionally. You'll never know how God could have used you to impact the lives of the people around you. You'll never know what God was up to in your life if you allow your doubt to take you out, to take you off track, and to force you somewhere other than where your Heavenly Father is leading you. You'll never know because, like the disciples, you can't possibly know what hangs in the balance right now. You can't know what God is up to. Now, this whole concept, like this entire tension and all of this is very real to me because I am a classic doubter. I wasn't raised in the church, and I came to faith as a young adult. At least in age, I was an adult. But I decided kind of in the midst of all this one day to make it official. And I got baptized when I was 20. And after a long period of investigating and trying to make sense of it all, there was something that was really beautiful about it to me. Something that just rang true. And so I decided I need to like get off the fence and get baptized. But do you know what? Following that, the next several years, we're just like filled with doubt. And some days, like here's the experience I had. Some days it all felt so real and so good and so true, and other days it would feel like thinking adults really believe this? And it felt like I was just doing this back and forth thing, this constant tensions. Some days I felt like, man, I was just soaring, and other days I felt like I was sinking. And so here's what I started doing. I started crying out to Jesus. Like I started asking Jesus, if this is real and if this is good and if you're real and if this is right, would you help me? Jesus, would you help me? And what I will tell you is that over the next several years, it became very real to me. In fact, it became so real and so beautiful to me that I have devoted my entire life to proclaiming it. So you think about it. What you are witnessing this morning is like a doubter turned proclaimer. Now, if some of you've only known me as Pastor Jason, like the holiest man on the face of the earth. Okay? And if you think that, you are deeply deceived. But if you had known me back then, okay, if you had known me back then, you would know that what you're watching this morning is a miracle. And over the years, for me, Jesus has allowed me to see some miracles. I have. I've seen some marriages that were dead come to life and be restored. I've seen it. I've seen depressed and suicidal people come to be filled with joy. I have seen extremely selfish people become some of the most generous people on the face of the earth. I one time prayed for a very sick woman, and while I was praying, she was completely healed. And I don't have time to get into that whole story. We don't have time for that, but it was crazy. And I've seen some stuff that has blown my mind. But when I think about my life walking with Jesus, there is one thing that stands out to me the most. When I was first beginning this whole process, and when there was this huge storm of doubt around me all the time, I was tempted to just walk away from Jesus over a girl. I met a very attractive, very fun girl, and we dated for a while. And I had this sense, okay, it wasn't like a voice or anything like that, but I had this sense that Jesus was saying to me, she is not going to lead you where I want you to go. And I had this feeling that to pursue this girl and to keep kind of going after this, to pursue that was essentially to walk away from Jesus. And so really I had to choose. Now she was nice looking, she was fun, she was nice. Okay, she wasn't wicked, or anything. And so the questions about faith were just pounding me. Is this really true? Is it really true? Is this really worth it? Is it really true? Is it really worth it? Because I'm about to give something up. And as you can guess, I did. I ended up walking away from that relationship. I decided that Jesus and all that I was encountering with him was too beautiful to give all of that up for her. And it was a big, big decision because of how clear the whole thing was for me. So yesterday I was reading scripture and I was journaling, And this has kind of become my new routine over the last year and a half or so. I'm trying to be disciplined about reading Scripture daily and then journaling. And I'm on this reading plan that some of you also are on. It's called the Moravian Reading Plan. And it breaks the Bible into these like bite-sized daily readings. And so I read these passages that are laid out there, and then I ask two questions. As I'm done reading it, I ask, what is God saying to me through this? And what am I going to do about it? So right now, the Moravian text has me reading through the book of Proverbs. And yesterday I was reading Proverbs 31. And in verse 10 of Proverbs 31, it says, a wife of noble character, who can find? She is worth far more than rubies. And it was one of those moments where it was just like, oh yeah. And God just captured my attention. And I thought about the reality that like, whoa, like God gave me one of those. You know, I'm married to that. And I could not imagine loving somebody or respecting somebody more. And there's all this stuff about, you know, this wife in the book of Proverbs. And in verse 20 it says, she opens her arms to the poor and extends her hands to the needy. And I was like, man, I know a chick like that. And I know that she's generous because of this deep love for God that she has. And I just thought about this ridiculous adventure that we've been on. And for those of you that don't know, we're actually coming up on 20 years at the end of the month. 20 years. And I'll tell you, as much as I'm building Jen up so far, the first couple years were not easy. They were hellacious at times. We were not connecting. We were not understanding each other. And man, we were mad at each other all the time. Just all the time. I'm just like, I thought I was pretty cool. How can this be happening? And I just remember over and over and over going to bed at night and saying, God, help me, because I don't know how to fix this. God, help me with this. Help us connect. Help me to understand what I don't understand. Help me to see what I don't see. Help me to learn to love her, and help us to learn to communicate and for us to connect. And God did that. And it would have been so easy to bail. I mean, people bail on that kind of thing all the time. And where it's like, God, we need you. God, we need you. God, we need you. I'm trusting you. I'm putting my faith in you. I'm trusting that this is true, and I'm trusting that this is worth it. I'm trusting it's true and it's worth it. And God met us there, and I look at our life now and I go, wow. We've been to Haiti like 13 times. We started this church. We're raising kids together. It's just been an unbelievable adventure. But there have been so many moments along the way where we've had to wrestle with that question. Is it worth it? Is it true? Is it worth it? Is it true? And I'm telling you, you'll never know what God have done, what God would have done, if you allow your doubt to take you out. You can walk with Jesus through your doubt. You can. And you won't know what's on the other side unless you do.